100 questions about writing in 5 minutes or less. I'm going to batch a number of questions and answers here together because the recording session today has become quite long. So let's move on. Okay, question 25. What's the best part about being an author? Maybe this sounds cheesy, maybe it sounds corny, but it's meeting fans. When someone has read some of your books and has enjoyed them, obviously, it's great to meet them and talk about it. Not because I'm an egomaniac and I want them to say, oh, your books are fantastic and they changed my life and oh, this is brilliant. It's a case of they've read the book and they've absorbed it and understood what I was trying to go for. And they've had an emotional response as a result. That's what I'm most interested in, that someone has read it and it's affected them, it's impacted them in some way. Sometimes they read a book and say, oh, it's really fun. Great, that's still an emotional response. They've enjoyed it. If someone reads your book and just goes, yeah, it was all right, that's worse than someone saying they didn't enjoy it. You want some kind of a response. A meh is the worst thing you can have as an author. So meeting other writers is kind of on par with meeting readers because we get to talk about stories and characters and the publishing side and agents and all this kind of inside baseball stuff that we can't always talk about in public. But equally, I love bouncing ideas off other writers, and some of them do stuff that's very, very different to me, so that it's not a case of I'm worried about them copying things, but I can use them as sounding boards and say, what about this, what about that? And I know I'll get a good response, I know I'll get a good reaction, I know that I'll get actually constructive criticism. One of the problems when you're first being a writer and you're trying to be traditionally published or even indie publishing is getting feedback from people that you can trust. Yes, paying an editor can help you improve the structure of the work, but it's the other stuff that really is important sometimes. The characters, the world building, the emotional response, and finding people you can trust to give you that can be really, really difficult. So meeting other writers is probably the other really cool thing about being an author. Because other authors have been there too. They've gone through exactly the same struggles of writing that first draft, of editing the book, of working with an editor or your agent and the publisher and the covers and promotion and PR and marketing and events. They've done all of this many times. So having that shared experience, having that shared knowledge and being able to help other people and they help you in turn, finding your community is just absolutely phenomenal, which is why I always talk about events and why I think they're so important. Even when I was coming up, when I was trying to get traditionally published, I met a number of people that I'm still friends with today. Some of them went on to become writers, some of them didn't. Some of them have nothing to do with writing now, but I'm still in contact with some of them. And I think it's really, really important. Some of them are agents, some of them are editors, within the business now. It really but it was great to have a group of people that I trusted then, and the numbers have grown over the years as I've made friends with other writers. So if you are going to be a writer, you want to do that, try and go to events if you can in person. If not, online is okay, but it's not as useful. As much fun as panels are, I always say this, panels and going to talks and Q&A sessions are brilliant. The best thing is out of hours, talking to writers. You don't have to drink, but you can drink pop or soft drinks, whatever you want to call it. Talking to other people when they're not performing, when they're not in front of an audience, you find out a lot more useful stuff. You can really talk to people and pick their brain and question them about things and ask for help or whatever it might be. And those are some of the best talks I've had in the 10 years since I've been traditionally published and the previous 10 years or so when I was trying to get an agent. Okay, question 26. What was the first book you couldn't put down? So I thought about this. Now the obvious answer is something I read very, very early, is The Hobbit. I've got a lovely illustrated hardback edition that I absolutely loved, and I'd read that. But thinking about it, it's not a case of that I couldn't put it down, I just loved that book. I think it was later when I was reading and picking up books myself, going out when I was a teen and thinking I have to kind of keep reading these books. And I think it was one of the early Shannara books by Terry Moore. I think it was one of the early Shannara books. I think it was one of the early Shannara books by Terry Brooks. And I read The Sword of Shannara and The Elfstones of Shannara, but I think, and the Wish I can't even say it, The Wish Song of Shannara, which was the kind of the original books. But then I think I'd caught up with where he was, and there was a new wave of books that was announced that was coming out that started with the Scions of Shannara. And I think it was that book. I think it was because the previous books had felt like the previous generations, or I've been kind of catching up on older fantasy books because they were, even given my age, no jokes, that they weren't coming out then. But those Shannara books were kind of coming out brand new whilst I was, a young teen, I think it would have been. And I think one of those early Shannara books was like, hang on, this is it. This is brand new. No one's read this before. This is amazing. And it felt like my generation of Shannara books, as it were. Like people talk about Star Wars films, and this is my version. I grew up with the prequels, or I grew up with this, or whatever it might be. I think in terms of the Shannara books, it was the Heritage Shannara series. There's 4 of them. The Scions, the Druid, the Elf Queen, and the Talisman. Those were the 4. But that first one, I think I just kind of sat down and I had to read it. I had to get through it. I needed to know what was going on because I'd read the previous books and loved them. But suddenly, it's a brand new generation and it felt like this is my book. So I've just checked, and The Scions of Shannara was first published in 1990. So that's kind of fits with my kind of teenage years. And it's a minor spoiler if you haven't read the series, but one of the main characters kind of dies in the previous generation. And this is suddenly, it's the next generation of heroes. They're having kind of, something happens, something dark starts rising, and they're picking up the pieces and trying to work out what's going on. But everyone who was involved previously is dead or gone. And suddenly it's all brand new, it's all fresh. And so I think that's why it felt very, very fresh for me. And it was something that I couldn't put down because this is my version. This is my Shannara book. And I absolutely loved them. And they still have very fond memories for me. I haven't gone back and read them in quite a while. So I am curious now. But Terry Brooks, David Eddings were definitely kind of formative ones. Thinking back on it now, I think David Eddings, if you read them, you'd say they were middle grade now, probably. It may be young YA. But Terry Brooks always felt very kind of adult fantasy for me. And maybe because I was a teen and I was like, yes, this is my first adult fantasy series. This is me stepping forward into adulthood at 14. Clearly not. But it felt like that at the time. So yeah, that's definitely the book that I couldn't put down. Question 27. What were 3 of your favourite books from your childhood? The Hobbit, for sure. I loved it as a kid. It was one of the books that my parents read to me. I read the paperback. I have a beautiful illustrated hardback edition with paintings. I'll put up a picture here so you can see which one I'm talking about. I loved it. Really, really. My parents were like, oh, he's reading. This is great. And he loves this book. They did a stage show, believe it or not, a local theatre. And I went when I was 10 maybe and went and saw this. I wanted to go to the theatre as a child, apart from kind of pantomime. Seems a bit kind of strange, but I was into it. My parents were happy and they took me. And I've still got the programme for it somewhere from when I was very, very little. 2 other favourite childhood books. I think The Animals of Farthing Wood. I read a lot of those because I read them all at the library and just kind of went through the whole lot. And I still remember some of them. I know people will say like Wind in the Willows, but I never read that when I was little. I think it's because I was thinking, oh, it's too much like Farthing Wood, I'll just read this. And of course they're very, very kind of different series. The Belgariad, that's the first Sword of... I can't remember what the first... No, Pawn of Prophecy. That's the first book in the Belgariad series by David Eddings. I was borrowing that initially from my brother. He'd read them and then I just borrowed his and then I kept reading. And then the second wave, the Malorian, I think they're called, they came out when I was a young kid as well. And I loved them. And the Sparhawk books that David Eddings did, all of them were fantastic books as a kid. I absolutely loved. C.S. Lewis, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe books, I loved them as well. We didn't have any films at that point. We didn't have any TV series or any kind of adaptations. The books were absolutely the thing. The Earthsea books, I know I've done more than 3, but who cares? The Earthsea books by Ursula Le Guin. She was another childhood author that I grew up reading. And I think at the time, the Earthsea books were a little bit advanced for me. I didn't really get all of it, but I still loved them. So A Wizard of Earthsea for sure. And when I was growing up, it was just the Earthsea trilogy. A Wizard of Earthsea and then The Tombs of Atuan. And then the third one is The Farthest Shore. But over the years, she then released other stories and other books. So now I've gone back and I've got the collections of all of these in beautiful hardbacks with paintings by Charles Vesey and drawings and stuff. So there are a number of Earthsea stories and books that I haven't read. And I'm a little bit afraid of going back. Now, I know Le Guin is a fantastic writer, and she has done many other things too. But going back and rereading something that was so formative and so important to me as a child, it's a little scary because I've done it in the past with some books and they just haven't held up to the memories. And yes, obviously I'm not the same as I was when I was reading them. I've evolved and grown up and changed. Mind has evolved and everything about me has changed. But there's still that kind of, I don't want to go back and say, oh, it's rose-tinted glasses, because it wasn't. It was, at that time, I loved it for what it was. And going back and reading it now, I don't know, it might kind of impact my memories of that, and I don't think I want to. I might read some of the later stuff that I haven't read before in the Earthsea books and see what they're like, because I am curious about them, but I don't think I want to go right back to the beginning and read this. Okay, last question for today. What do you think is the effect of ego on a writer's success? So this is an interesting question. I think in order to be a writer, in order to want to, if you're traditionally published or indie published, you have to have a certain amount of ego. You have to have some kind of baseline belief that you have something to say that other people want to read and would want to hear. That, you know, there are millions of books out there, and if someone just goes in the approach of, oh, well, you know, I haven't really got anything to say, but I want to put this story out there, that's not really a great approach. I'm not saying everyone has to be extrovert and has to be kind of all the time banging away on social media and being the loudest person in the room and being gobby all of the time and anything like that. But I think you have to believe in yourself to a certain degree, and you have to have a little bit of ego in order to get you through the difficult times. That's not just a case of the early stages of finishing a book, because that is an enormous struggle, an enormous slog, and when you get to the end of that first draft, you've achieved something that many, many people set out to do, that they say they will do, and they never get there. So it requires a certain amount of belief, persistence, discipline and motivation in order to do it. Then say if you get an agent and the book comes out and it does well, that's great. But then people are going to ask you for the next book and they expect it to be as good or better. And if your first book comes out and it just does okay, it's that ability to dust yourself off, reset yourself and carry on and write a new story, believing there again that you can do it, that you have something to say, that, you know, for whatever reason it didn't work, you can learn from it, you can grow and you can adapt from it. In terms of success, some people start to believe their own BS. They start to buy into it and think that they are awesome and amazing and fantastic. In a previous question, I talked about Robin Hobb, who I think is one of the best writers in the fantasy genre, and yet she's still so grounded and down to earth and so approachable and such a lovely person. And I don't think the ego has gone to her head in her case. I think writers, like anybody else, need to surround themselves with the kind of people that will keep them grounded. Having a day job sometimes helps, whether it's part-time or full-time. Some people don't want to go full-time writing because they say it feels too disconnected from reality. Even if you're writing fantasy, some people are saying, yeah, I don't want that total disconnect. I don't want to just live in a bubble and believe everything that I'm told, that I'm awesome, and I just go on and write the books. Some people have friends, family in particular, and ordinary things that you still have to do. Like, you know, I've written this awesome book and it's sold thousands of copies and I've won all these awards. Yet, you still got to go and change the baby's nappy. You know, really kind of grounded earth, basic things that you have to do. That'll bring you down to earth really, really quickly. But it's when writers don't have that, I think there's a real concern, where people spend so much time on social media. It can be very damaging because you can see a lot of negative comments that can really knock you, but equally it can go the other way. If people are just praising you all the time and saying that you're awesome, that's a dangerous thing too. You need those kind of controls where people can kind of remind you of what's actually important in the world and your life, and therefore your writing's place within the world. I've met some very, very popular, very best-selling fantasy authors in my time, and a few of them outside of the bubble of the genre are just not that well known. So when they go into a fantasy convention, people are, you know, falling over them, really excited to see them, really happy, wanting to sign their books, you know, and then in the other part of their life, nobody really gives a monkeys. They're just kind of really like, oh, what do you do? Oh, you write books? Oh, that's interesting. You know, has it done well? Because they don't know. It's not a part of their life. And I think that can be very humbling. And I think that can really kind of keep you grounded. And I think that those kind of reminders are essential for anybody, so that your ego doesn't swell so big that you believe you're the best thing in the world ever and that everybody should bow down at your feet for the awesome book that you've written. So I think ego is something that writers have to be very careful of and keep a close eye on, and also have people that can tell you and maybe do an intervention if you start to believe your own nonsense too much.